Council, the situation in the occupied West Bank is also highly concerning. Daily attacks by Israeli settlers, military incursion, and the destruction of homes and civilian infrastructure are part of a well-oiled system of segregation and oppression. UNRWA's operation space is shrinking, with arbitrary measures imposed by Israel to restrict the presence and the movement of staff. It is becoming increasingly difficult to keep our schools and health centers open and accessible. Legislative and administrative action to evict UNRWA from its headquarters in East Jerusalem and prohibit its activities on Israeli territory are also on the way. Mr. President, amid these challenges, serious allegations against individual UNRWA personnel in Gaza emerged in January. Horrified by this allegation, I immediately terminated the appointment of those concerned. The Secretary General ordered an investigation through the Office of Internal Oversight Services. In parallel, an independent review group is assessing how UNRWA upholds neutrality, a core principle guiding our work. Despite this prompt and decisive action, a significant amount of donors' funding remains suspended. This has serious operational implications and undermines the financial sustainability of the agency. Be assured that we remain firmly committed to implementing the recommendation of the review and to strengthening existing safeguards against neutrality breaches. Member of the Council, as I informed the General Assembly in March, calls for UNRWA's closure are not about adherence to humanitarian principles. These calls are about ending the refugee status of millions of Palestinians. They seek to change the long-standing political parameters for peace in the occupied Palestinian territory set by the resolution of the General Assembly and this Council. Accusations that UNRWA deliberately perpetuates refugee status are false and dishonest. The agency exists because a political solution does not. It exists in lieu of a state that can deliver critical public services. The international community has long attempted to contain, rather than resolve, the Israel-Palestine conflict. Lip service is paid to the two-state solution each time an escalation occurs, costing lives and hope. UNRWA was created 75 years ago as a temporary agency, a stopgap measure pending a political answer to the question of Palestine. If the international community truly commits to a political solution, UNRWA can retrieve its temporary nature by supporting a time-bound transition, delivering education, primary health care, and social support. It can do so until a Palestinian administration takes over these services, absorbing UNRWA's Palestinian personnel as civil servants. Mr. President, dismantling UNRWA will have lasting repercussions. In the short term, it will deepen the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and accelerate the onset of famine. In the longer term, it will jeopardize the transition from ceasefire to day after by depriving a traumatized population of essential services. It will make nearly impossible the formidable task of bringing 500,000 deeply distressed girls and boys back to learning. Failing to deliver on education will condemn an entire generation to despair, fueling anger, resentment, and endless cycles or violence. A political solution cannot succeed in such a scenario. Members of the Council, let me conclude with 3 appeals. First, I call on Council members to act in accordance with General Assembly Resolution 302 and safeguard UNRWA's critical role, both now and within the framework of the transition. UNRWA has long been a custodian of the rights of Palestinian refugees. It can only relinquish its central role of providing critical services and protecting human rights when a political solution is realized. Until then, the political support of member states must be matched by funding. Second, I urge you to commit to a genuine political process culminating in a solution that can bring peace to Palestinians and Israelis. This process must uphold Palestinian refugees' right and aspiration to a just and lasting political solution to their plight. Third, we must acknowledge that a political process alone will not guarantee a sustainable peace. The wounds that run deep in this region cannot be healed without cultivating empathy and rejecting dehumanization that is rampant, whether in political rhetoric or in the misuse of new technology in warfare. We must refuse to choose between empathizing with either Palestinian or Israelis, or showing compassion for either Gazan or Israeli hostages and their families. Instead, we must recognize and reflect in our words and action that Palestinians and Israelis share a long and profound experience of grief and loss, that they are equally deserving of a peaceful and secure future. I urge you to help realize this future through principled multilateral action and a genuine commitment to peace. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Lazzarini for his briefing. I will now make a statement in my capacity as Foreign Minister of Malta. I began by thanking UNRWA Commissioner General, Mr. Philip Lazzarini, for his powerful briefing. Malta firmly reiterates that UNRWA is an indispensable lifeline for Palestine refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, and a stabilizing force in the region. Particularly amid the current catastrophic conditions in Gaza, Malta continues to be a regular contributor to the agency. Preserving the life-saving role and operations of UNRWA must be our primary objective. In Gaza today, we continue to witness the failure to uphold the laws of armed conflict. Personifying this is the staggering destruction and death of over 33,000 people in Gaza, the majority of whom are women and children. It is further manifested in the continued onerous, arbitrary, and bureaucratic impediments preventing the necessary humanitarian scale up into and throughout the Gaza Strip. We are witnessing an entire population being brought to the brink of conflict-induced starvation, with credible reports that famine has already taken hold in the north. We are even seeing it in the lack of respect for the humanitarian notification and deconfliction system, despite the provisions of Resolution 2712. This is evident in the recent killing of the 7 World Central Kitchen workers, which occurred on the 1st of April, and the attack on an ambulance trying to reach 6-year-old Hind Rajab on the 29th of January, which resulted in more casualties. There are many more examples of this. Over 220 humanitarian aid workers, including over 100 UNRWA staff, have been killed since the beginning of this conflict. Many were killed providing urgent humanitarian assistance. Malta welcomed the UN's swift response to the establishment of 2 investigations to the deeply concerning allegations regarding the involvement of UNRWA staff in the terror attacks of 7th of October. We also welcome the commissioning of an independent review into the agency's adherence to the principle of neutrality. We note that the interim report of this review has indicated UNRWA has in place a significant number of mechanisms and procedures to ensure compliance with the humanitarian principle of neutrality. We now look forward to the outcome of both ongoing inquiries, including the Commission's final report due on the 20th of April, and call on all parties to fully cooperate with these inquiries. Regrettably, due to these allegations, several critical donors took the decision to suspend their funding to UNRWA at a time when the people of Gaza were in greatest need and stability in the region, for which UNRWA is a major contributor, is now threatened. We commend those who have continued or have since resumed their contributions. We appeal to others to resume the desperately needed funding and ensure that the agency has the necessary resources to operate. It is in this vein that Malta recently issued a further financial contribution. In these difficult times, we need to avoid politicizing the work of humanitarian actors and undermining the work and legitimacy of the United Nations and humanitarian actors in Gaza. It is also important to ensure that accountability for any violations of international law, including international humanitarian law, is ensured. It is our responsibility to protect those, such as UNRWA staff, who risk their lives to help and protect others. I thank you. And I now resume my function as President of the Council. I give the floor to His Excellency, Mr. Ahmed Attaf, Minister for Foreign Affairs and National Community Abroad of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. لا أجد خير.
Thank you, President. At the outset, I cannot but bow down with the utmost respect before you. Thank you for paying tribute to 178 UNRWA staff who gave their lives, perishing as a result of Israeli crimes which continue to be perpetrated against Gaza. And these were people who stretched out their hand to our Palestinian brothers who were feeling the brunt of this unjust war which was imposed on them. Furthermore, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General, I would like to pay tribute to you and to all UNRWA staff I would like to pay tribute to your sense of sacrifice, your selfless efforts, which are characteristic of your agency. In fact, they are synonymous with it. We want to express to you our deep appreciation for your efforts, because we see in it one of the last glimmers of hope. Now, this hope is being diminished, and yet the Palestinian people is clinging on to this hope throughout the tragedy it's living through. You embody the ideals and the values on which this organization, this House of Humanity and Civilization, is built on. A house which never lets the cries of the oppressed fall on deaf ears, nor the cries of suffering. Nor to the cries and wailing of our brothers who have fallen in Gaza. Furthermore, you are the best, most authentic witnesses of the modern Nakba, which the Palestinians are currently going through, following the great historical Nakba. You carry high the flag of international commitment to the Palestinian people. You are the foremost expression of solidarity, as you have taken up the just cause of the Palestinians. 75 years have gone by since UNRWA was established. UNRWA is as old as the Palestinian cause itself. Over these decades, the agency has exhibited its extreme importance and its central role in supporting Palestine refugees, so as to lighten the burden of their displacement, without any true solution to their cause on the horizon. Today, as things stand, this UN agency is being subjected to flagrant attacks. It's being targeted in a shameful way. It's being targeted by the expansionist occupation power, Israel. Israel did not hesitate in bombing of 160 UNRWA facilities. It spilled the blood of UNRWA staff and employees. It used fallacious pretexts, any excuse possible, to reduce the agency's funding and to put an end to its very existence. There can be no doubt about it. The international community is now fully cognizant of the intentions of the occupying power, as well as of the objectives which it hopes to achieve through this policy. A policy which is at odds with the international solidarity that is UNRWA's mandate. And we saw this at the General Assembly just a few months ago. UNRWA is indeed being targeted because it reflects the very characteristics of Palestine refugees. These refugees have their own agency, an agency which meets their needs, in contrast to all other refugees the world over. UNRWA is also being targeted because it is inextricably linked to Resolution 194, as well as other resolutions which enshrined the rights of the Palestinian people to return home, to go back home to their territory, to go back to their homeland. Third, the third reason that UNRWA is being targeted is because this is a key component of Israel's plot to liquidate the Palestinian cause, to strip the Palestinian national project of its very content. This is a pillar of the Palestinian state. Confronted with the situation, the international community must exhibit courage. It must protect UNRWA and facilitate its vital activities, helping millions of Palestinian refugees and the Palestinian diaspora. This is a stance which should guarantee the legal status of UNRWA by hampering Israeli attempts to transfer UNRWA's functions to other bodies. And this comes on top of the need to establish mechanisms which could guarantee sufficient funding, long-term sufficient funding for the agency's activities by including them in the organization's regular budget. Algeria welcomes the growing number of international community members who have decided to reverse their decision to suspend funding to UNRWA. My country calls on other states to follow suit, to take the same level-headed stance, because this is a way of responding to the cries for help we're hearing from thousands, in fact millions of Palestinians who have been compelled to flee, they were displaced. They've been stripped of their most basic rights, their right to have a roof over their heads. They've been deprived of the very minimal conditions of life and livelihoods. His Excellency, the President of the Republic, Mr. Al-Zahra, have proclaimed that there will be an exceptional financial contribution, $15 million. This money will go to UNRWA. This is an exceptional, an extraordinary contribution which will go on top, which will come on top of Algeria's other contributions, which have been provided directly to the Palestinian Authority. We believe that we are truly duty-bound, that we have a responsibility to honor this pledge, and the same can be said for other members of the international community. We are unswervingly convinced that UNRWA must continue its work as long as there are Palestine refugees. And in fact, the return of Palestinian refugees is an inalienable right, which cannot be denied. It cannot be preempted. Furthermore, the Palestinian cause is indivisible. It is comprehensive. It cannot be dismembered and nor divided. We are similarly convinced that Israel's expansionist occupation cannot continue in defiance of the entire international community. Because the two-state solution cannot be held hostage by the dithering, by the manipulation that the occupying power is engaged in. The international community cannot be taken prisoner by the occupying power's miscalculations, its disillusionment. This cannot go on indefinitely. The international community must make its voice heard.
I'll give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Tsukasa Umura, Special Envoy of the Middle East of Japan.
Thank you. I would like to pay tribute to the initiative of Jordan in proposing this meeting. I also thank Mr. Philip Lazzarini, Commissioner General of UNRWA, for his briefing. Mr. President, more than 6 months have passed since the terror attacks by Hamas and others and the subsequent outbreak of fighting in Gaza. The humanitarian situation on the ground is literally a serious crisis. According to reports from international organizations, about half of Gaza's population, or about 1.1 million people, are expected to enter the most severe stage of famine. They are suffering from shortages of even minimum essential goods for human life, such as safe water, food, shelter, medicine, and necessities for women and children, and poorest sanitary conditions. Human dignity, to which Japan attaches great importance, is under threat. There is a growing risk of destabilization in neighboring countries that host Palestinian refugees. In response, the Security Council under Japan's presidency adopted the Resolution 2728 on March 25. Mr. President, needless to say, UNRWA has been playing an extremely important role in providing humanitarian assistance to Gazans facing such a devastating humanitarian crisis and has made many sacrifices. Regarding allegations that UNRWA staff members were involved in the terror attack on Israel on October 7 last year, Japan appreciates the progress being made to strengthen UNRWA's governance under the leadership of Secretary General Guterres. Japan highly welcomes the interim report which has been submitted to the Secretary General by the Independence Review Group led by Madame Colonna and the action plan which has been formulated by UNRWA Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini. Japan lifted its suspension of funding to UNRWA on April 2nd and has already completed a disbursement of approximately $35 million. In the Gaza Strip, we will provide assistance to women and children to improve sanitary conditions. We will also provide such support as medical services for Palestinian refugees in the West Bank, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. Mr. President, the Independence Review Group is currently working toward developing its final report and recommendations to be presented on April 20. In consideration of the final report, Japan will continue to support UNRWA's reform efforts in cooperation with other donors. As a part of our support, Japan will contribute to the development and implementation of training to strengthen the neutrality of frontline management staff, which is one of the action items of UNRWA. Mr. President, since October 7 last year, Japan has launched a series of humanitarian assistance contributions to the Palestinian people, the scale of which exceeds $100 million. Japan is calling for the release of hostages and compliance with international humanitarian law, and making a series of diplomatic efforts taking into account what can be a realistic approach to improve the humanitarian situation, including a ceasefire. I thank you very much.
His Excellency Mr. Yumura for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we'd like to thank the Commissioner General of the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini. Thank you for your report about the situation in the occupied Palestinian territories, OPT, in the context of the activities of the UN body he heads up. His assessments are most worrisome. The Council should have discussed them long ago. For the 7th month, we're seeing an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in the Gaza Strip. Everyone knows about the facts, the unthinkable statistics, the number of people dead and those in need of urgent food and medical assistance, as well as reported cases of people dying of famine and dehydration, including minors. Despite the demands of the UN Security Council pursuant to Resolution 2728 and in violation of international humanitarian law, in the enclave, we're seeing an escalation of military hostilities. In the last 24 hours alone, it has claimed the lives of 68 people. Under these conditions, the delivery of humanitarian assistance to the people of Gaza is practically impossible. UN agencies are saying in unison that humanitarian access to the enclave is practically non-existent. According to OCHA, the IDF is blocking half of humanitarian convoys heading to the Strip. Yet, according to aid agencies, there is aid. Supplies are waiting at the border. There are financial resources for organizing the deliveries. They're sufficient. It all comes down to opening the checkpoints and ensure the security of the convoys. We've warned time and time again that in the absence of lasting sustainable ceasefire, which must be duly monitored by military observers, all of our humanitarian efforts are doomed. Colleagues, humanitarian workers are defenseless in the face of an army which has weapons. No voluntary deconflicting can be of help if one of the parties is intent on continuing military hostilities, especially when one of the Security Council members is sending messages that Security Council resolutions are supposedly non-binding. Against this backdrop, the role of UNRWA in the OPT is indispensable. We call on you to pay tribute to the heroism of agency staff. They are implementing their humanitarian mandate under inhumane conditions. They are paying with their lives. So far, 178 staff have perished. This is the highest number of staff of a UN agency that have died all at once. Against this backdrop, what's categorically unacceptable are attempts to label UNRWA a terrorist organization, as well as calls to close it down, which we've also witnessed here in this very chamber. Unfounded allegations leveled at UNRWA staff shouldn't be used to tarnish this entire organization, which is large, it's highly important. It has 13,000 staff working in Gaza alone. If UNRWA can no longer work, this will become yet another legal and a moral tool for indirect collective punishment being meted out on millions of Palestinians in dire need of aid. Since the conflict escalated in the area of the Palestine-Israeli zone, roughly 2 million Palestinians have been forced to leave their homes. Yet the largest portion of IDPs found refuge in UNRWA facilities, which, despite their status, are still being subjected to Israeli bombing. As recently as the 12th of April, a primary school in the Nuseirat refugee camp, which actually enjoys UNRWA patronage, was bombed. 1 person died, 9 were injured. This demonstrates that there's a deliberate attack on years of efforts, on advances made by humanitarian aid workers who are protecting the civilian population. In parallel, the Western Jerusalem authorities are circumscribing the agency's activities in the Gaza Strip. Since the 24th of March, humanitarian access to the northern governorates of the Strip have been blocked. The situation is most dire there. Movement of UNRWA staff in the West Bank is also restricted. Agency's banking operations have been made more difficult, as have customs and visa operations. Against this backdrop, we are outraged. We cannot understand the decision taken by a number of key donors to suspend funding to UNRWA, owing to allegations that were leveled at its staff, allegations of cooperating with Hamas. And this despite the fact that Western Jerusalem still hasn't presented any evidence to incriminate the 12 staff it has named. We categorically condemn attempts to discredit the agency through disinformation campaigns. We believe that UNRWA funding should be restored in full before the investigation is finalized, and the investigation must, in fact, be objective, based not only on information provided by Israel, but also information from the Palestinians. There is no alternative to UNRWA. It is the channel for providing assistance to Palestinians both in the OPT and this until we find a fair settlement of their status within the framework of the settlement of the Palestinian issue. Clearly, against the backdrop of the broader regional turbulence we're seeing, the needs of Palestinian refugees are only going to get bigger. Thus, a number of countries should take upon themselves additional financial duties, and we commend this. We call on other states to support UNRWA on a depoliticized basis so as to ensure that it can conduct its work uninterrupted on a sustainable basis. On our side, we'll continue assisting UNRWA in all sorts of ways, including through our annual voluntary contributions to the agency. After all, its activities are of humanitarian import, but they also have a political dimension. They have an important stabilizing effect on the entire Middle Eastern region. Madam President, the only way to stop the catastrophe in Gaza from spreading is an immediate ceasefire across the board, ensuring safe and unhindered humanitarian access to all Gazans in need of assistance. This is also necessary to prevent the threat of the crisis broadening. UN Security Council Resolution 2728 seems to be not enough. That's clear. It's simply not being implemented. Ramadan is over. The issue of a lasting ceasefire remains very acute. We take as our starting point that the UN Security Council will revert to the consideration of this issue very shortly. Once again, I'd like to remind you, not implementing binding UN Security Council resolutions should result in sanctions being imposed on those violating these resolutions. And we believe that the Council needs to consider this issue as a matter of urgency. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you, Madam President. I should like to begin by thanking UNRWA Commissioner General Lazzarini for the briefing he's just provided. Ecuador values his efforts and reiterates our constant support for his work. Madam President, last January, worrisome reports were published of accusations that various UNRWA staff members had participated in the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October, attacks which Ecuador condemns once again. In this regard, my country hopes that the investigation underway will allow the facts to be established as soon as possible, and that those individually responsible are brought to justice for anything they are determined responsible to have perpetrated. For this to happen, all parties must cooperate with the Office of Internal Oversight Services of the United Nations and provide all relevant information in a timely manner. In addition, on the 20th of March, it was announced that the independent group appointed by the Secretary-General to review UNRWA's work had observed that this agency has underway a significant number of mechanisms and procedures to guarantee compliance with the humanitarian principle of neutrality, and also that it has identified various critical areas which still need to be addressed. The final report of the independent group, which will be circulated in just a few days' time, must be carefully analysed, and its recommendations will be extremely important. Madam President, colleagues, 178 UNRWA staff members have died as a result of the war. And, Mr. Lazzarini, I reiterate my country's condolences to their families. UNRWA's work is vitally important to alleviate the situation of the civilian population in Gaza and in other areas of the Middle East. A possible suspension of UNRWA's activities would, without a doubt, also affect the work entrusted to the senior coordinator, Sigrid Kaag, and the implementation of this Council's resolutions. Therefore, to conclude, I reiterate my call upon all those who are able to contribute to financing the agency's operations, since their continuation is a factor for stability in the whole region. Thank you very much.
Representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Commissioner General Lazzarini, for your briefing. The United States mourns that at least 178 UNRWA staff have been killed in this conflict. We mourn the loss of dedicated humanitarians and valued colleagues. This conflict has been one of the worst in recent memory in terms of the number of aid workers who have been killed. More than 240 humanitarian workers have been killed since October 7 in Gaza, many while on duty. Even more have been injured. These incidents are unacceptable. Humanitarian personnel must be protected, full stop. We are deeply concerned. Israel has not done enough to protect humanitarian aid workers or civilians. For that reason, The resolution the United States introduced last month in this council demanded, and I quote, "All parties to the conflict fully respect humanitarian notification and deconfliction mechanisms and remediate any deficiencies," unquote. Although Russia and China vetoed that resolution, we repeat that call today. As President Biden conveyed to Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu on April 4, Israel must, quote, "implement a series of specific, concrete, and measurable steps to address civilian harm, humanitarian suffering, and the safety of aid workers," unquote. U.S. policy with respect to Gaza will be determined by Israel's immediate and sustained action on these steps. As this council knows, the United States paused additional funding to UNRWA as a result of the serious allegations regarding UNRWA personnel allegedly participating in the horrific October 7 attacks. The U.S. Congress has since prohibited additional contributions until at least March 2025. We urge UNRWA and the wider UN system to take all steps necessary to strengthen the neutrality of the organization and improve UNRWA's sustainability. At the same time, we recognize UNRWA's indispensable role in distributing humanitarian assistance and maintaining continuity of care in Gaza, and we urge UNRWA's continued humanitarian access in Gaza and the lifting of onerous restrictions on its work. The United States is gravely concerned about the dire food insecurity and the very real risk of imminent famine. UNRWA is critical to averting this. Of course, as our Jordanian and other colleagues from the region can confirm, UNRWA also plays a crucial role throughout the region in contributing to the stability of the region and supporting Palestinian refugees. From educating hundreds of thousands of students to providing primary health care and critical relief and social services, UNRWA is the bedrock of support for the most vulnerable Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the West Bank. The United States supports this important work and emphasizes that it must continue uninterrupted. The United States has long advocated for reforms of UNRWA and emphasized the need to strengthen UNRWA's management and oversight. The final report of the Independent Review Group on UNRWA, commissioned by the Secretary General, and the results of the OIOS investigation will be important to guiding reform efforts. We welcome UNRWA's statement that the review group report will be the authoritative report for future action. For further accountability, we urge the Secretary General to provide a full and transparent plan for how he will follow up on this report. As we have conveyed, we expect the report to have clear and strong recommendations to guide UNRWA's work going forward and prevent the prospect of staff supporting terrorism. We have been impressed with the interim work and interviews and appreciate the complexity of the issues presented. We look forward to the review group's final recommendations. The United States will continue working with UNRWA, other donors, and hosts to implement reforms for UNRWA to remain operational as long as it is needed. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We want to thank Jordan for requesting this meeting on the UN Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East. And we want to thank Commissioner General for his briefing. We recall UNRWA is a lifeline for generations of Palestine refugees in Gaza, the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. It is an agency reflecting the historical responsibility of the collective membership of the UN. UNRWA is part of the social fabric of these areas of operations. It is a factor of stability. UNRWA's work is mandated by the UN General Assembly as a promise of a just solution of the Palestinian refugee question. It needs to be respected. Today we are discussing the critical work of drivers, social workers, nurses, teachers, sanitation workers, engineers, doctors, and other life-saving assistance providers. UNRWA staff members are the unsung heroes of the war in Gaza. This Council has held numerous discussions on the conflict in Gaza, marked by the dire human toll of the conflict, the threat of imminent famine, and a near collapse of basic services. UNRWA's work was evident at each and every one of these meetings, from providing shelters to internally displaced persons to delivering food and other essential goods. In the Council's discussions, their work is portrayed in a variety of ways. However, there is a general agreement that UNRWA has become indispensable because of its resources, experiences, and knowledge. NGOs working in Gaza have made it clear that they are unable to substitute for or absorb the role of UNRWA. Secretary General, UN agencies, and the UN coordinators dealing with Gaza crisis have also been clear. UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian response in Gaza. We take seriously the allegations against UNRWA employees brought forward in January. While they are concerning, we welcome the swift reaction from both the Secretary General and the Commissioner General. An OIOS investigation into these allegations was established. We're also looking beyond on how to further strengthen the agency's neutrality and transparency, and we are looking forward to the final report of the independent review of UNRWA. Slovenia has stood by UNRWA and consequently by the civilians that it serves. We have maintained our financial and political support throughout this crisis. We will continue to do so. We welcome the fact that a number of donors have reversed their decisions and resumed their financial support to the agency. We urge other donors to revoke their suspension of funding. And we call on new donors, small and large, to come forward. It is simply about the survival of the largest provider of aid in Gaza. It is about the survival of civilians in Gaza. We are concerned over the continued obstacles to UNRWA's work in Gaza and the West Bank, including East Jerusalem. UNRWA convoys are denied from entering Gaza and accessing the north of Gaza. UNRWA faces eviction from its headquarters in Jerusalem. These are some of very concrete examples. Among others, these actions must be reversed. Slovenia has consistently maintained clarity, and I want to reiterate. We stand by the UN Secretary General and the UN nation system in their efforts to alleviate the suffering of people in Gaza. We express our profound gratitude for the work of the UN and in particular for the work of UNRWA, which lies at the center of these efforts. We condemn attacks on UNRWA premises. These incidents must be duly investigated and the persons responsible held accountable. Madam President, the situation in Gaza is unprecedented. This Council has been facing its challenges in addressing it, but it has had a united voice on a number of occasions. As the situation continues to deteriorate, Slovenia repeats its call for an immediate ceasefire, the release of all hostages, removal of barriers to humanitarian aid, and the full implementation of Resolution 2728, 2720, and 2712. We also call for the full implementation of both ICJ's orders on provisional measures. Commissioner General, I want to take this opportunity to once again convey my government's condolences over the deaths of UNRWA staff members in the current conflict. I would emphasize that just last week, the Security Council underlined the need for accountability for all incidents involving the killing of humanitarian workers. UNRWA staff, along with all humanitarian and medical personnel working in Gaza, are the face of humanity in this conflict. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for their statements. I now give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank Malta's presidency for convening this important briefing on the Middle East, including the Palestine question, with particular focus on the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees in the Near East. We also wish to express our gratitude to Mr. Philip Lazzarini, Under Secretary General of the United Nations and Commissioner General of the UNRWA for his insight, as well as for his decisive humanitarian work on the ground. Madam President, I appreciate the opportunity to address the Security Council on the situation in the Middle East, particularly the ongoing humanitarian crisis in the occupied Palestinian territories and the vital work of UNRWA. The Gaza Strip faces a chronic humanitarian crisis impacting the livelihoods and access to essential services for its 2 million residents. Addressing this crisis is of utmost urgency, and unconditional humanitarian aid remains crucial in mitigating the suffering of civilians caught in the crossfire. Ensuring the safety and well-being of all civilians is paramount. Thus, the provision of humanitarian assistance should be unconditional and without any restrictions. Madam President, UNRWA's work extends far beyond the Gaza Strip, encompassing multiple regions in the Middle East. Its stability and predictability are crucial for the well-being of Palestinian refugees and their access to essential services. However, we are deeply concerned by the attacks on the UNRWA's works and restrictions placed on its personnel and the funding limitations which significantly undermine the organization's ability to carry out its vital humanitarian mission. Madam President, building trust and confidence between Israel and UNRWA is essential for addressing the needs of the affected populations. Balancing security concerns with humanitarian imperative remains a complex challenge, but dialogue and collaboration are crucial. We therefore urge the international community to engage in a constructive dialogue and reconsider their positions to ensure that humanitarian assistance reaches those in need during these challenging times. We further call upon all parties to comply with their obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law, and implement the relevant Security Council resolution on this issue. Madam President, in these challenging times, the pursuit of peace and humanitarian relief remains a must of our highest priority. We reiterate the urgent need for a full-scale end to hostilities in Gaza, transcending political bargaining and focusing on the well-being of civilians. Let us work towards a path of peace and prioritize humanity above all else. In concluding, Madam President, we extend our heartfelt appreciation to the Commissioner General of UNRWA and his entire team for their invaluable insights into the agency's crucial work, often carried out quietly and without recognition, contributing significantly to humanitarian efforts on the ground. We honor the UNRWA workers who have lost their lives while fulfilling their noble duties, and we offer our deepest respect to their memories. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, thank you for convening this meeting at the request of Jordan to discuss this very important issue. I also thank Mr. Philip Lazzarini, Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian refugees in the Near East, for his briefing that has outlined the status of the organization at this critical phase of its operation in Gaza and the broader Middle East. UNRWA represents and is a beacon of hope for Palestinian refugees since it was established by General Assembly Resolution 3024 of 1949 through to these present times. Over the years, we have reviewed numerous reports and briefings on its operations, and they all provide accounts of the organization's resilience and commitment, which has seen it adapt to the changing needs of the population it serves. The agency's direct relief and works program, the provision of education, healthcare, and social services to millions of people across Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem is a testimony to his long-standing commitment to the welfare and the human development of Palestinian refugees and people. However, UNRWA's ability to deliver at scale and provide adequate humanitarian assistance to civilians in the Gaza Strip and in other locations has been affected over these past months by the indiscriminate bombardment and collective punishment of the Gaza Strip since the 7th October attack on Israeli civilians by Hamas, and which has unarguably resulted in unseen levels of suffering and humanitarian need in Gaza. Regrettably, it has been reported that about 178 UNRWA staff have been killed and a good number of its premises damaged in the ongoing conflict. All these are violations of international law, in particular in international humanitarian law, as it relates to the protection of humanitarian personnel in times of armed conflicts. We expressed our deepest condolences to the families of all UNRWA personnel who have paid the ultimate price. We express solidarity with those who have been adversely impacted. Madam President, we have taken note of the allegation of the involvement of a small number of UNRWA personnel in the 7th October attacks. This has led to the suspension of funds by some major donors, even with the understanding that UNRWA is donor-driven. As we welcome the processes that have been initiated by UN Secretary General to investigate the allegations, we call on all those donors who have continued the suspension of funds to reconsider that decision, given the further developments and the appropriate steps being taken. Sierra Leone acknowledges UNRWA's vital role as a mainstay of humanitarian response services to the people of Palestine. We emphasize that UNRWA cannot be replaced by any other agency or entity, as the work they do for Palestinians, not only in Gaza, but across the wider region, is immeasurable and life-saving. In further acknowledging the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, exacerbated by the very real threat of famine and food insecurity, we call on all member states to strengthen the operational capacity of UNRWA. We appeal for sufficient, predictable, and sustained financial and other support to UNRWA and its services until a just and lasting solution to the plight of Palestinian refugees is found. In conclusion, Madam President, while I reiterate Sierra Leone's support for UNRWA, I equally emphasize the need for immediate permanent ceasefire in Gaza, respectful and implementation of Resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728. This, inter alia, will allow the unhindered flow of humanitarian aid into all parts of the Gaza Strip, including the north. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone, and I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. And I start by thanking Commissioner General Lazzarini for his briefing and for the work of all of your team. It is 75 years since UNRWA was mandated by the UN General Assembly to provide essential services to Palestinian refugees. Today, regrettably, that mandate remains as important as ever. Palestinians in Gaza are facing a devastating humanitarian crisis and an imminent risk of famine, and the region needs stability. Against this backdrop, I wish to make 3 points. First, the UK recognises that UNRWA is critical to aid delivery in Gaza. We call on Israel to allow UNRWA and all agencies providing humanitarian relief unhindered access in Gaza, particularly in the north. UNRWA is the main provider of humanitarian relief within Gaza, and other UN and humanitarian actors depend on UNRWA's distribution network to get aid to those in need. The UK remains committed to increasing humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. We're calling on Israel to increase aid flows and to enable the UN's minimum operating requirements so that humanitarian agencies can operate safely. Our Foreign Secretary has made this clear in his discussions with Israeli Foreign Minister Katz. Second, I want to recognise the essential role that UNRWA plays in providing health and education services and humanitarian relief across the region, including supporting some 4 million Palestinians in Jordan, Syria and Lebanon. This support is important for regional stability and is of particular importance at this critical time. Finally, to reiterate, the UK is appalled by allegations that some UNRWA staff were involved in the 7 October attacks on Israel. We note the ongoing investigations of the UN Office for Internal Oversight Services into these allegations. We also emphasise the importance of UNRWA continuing robust management reform, including stronger independent oversight and better detection systems. And we look forward to seeing the findings and recommendations of former French Foreign Minister Colonna's independent review into UNRWA's neutrality processes and systems. As our Prime Minister said this week, we will clarify the UK's position on funding once we've reviewed these. President, I want to end by recalling our minute of silence at the beginning of this meeting and by recognising the 178 UNRWA staff tragically killed in Gaza and pay tribute again to them and to offer condolences to their families. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank Jordan and other Arab countries for their initiative to propose convening this meeting and thank Commissioner General Lazzarini for his briefing. Since the outbreak of the conflict in Gaza over 6 months ago, more than 34,000 innocent civilians have lost their lives. Gaza is mired in an unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe. At this very moment, millions are struggling under hunger, diseases, pain, and despair. Amid the gloom of war and death, the light of humanitarianism has never faded. The United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, or UNRWA, is the backbone for humanitarian response for Palestine. It has maintained its operations in Gaza over the past 6 months, bringing the hope for survival to the suffering people in Gaza. UNRWA staff, while facing gunfire and bombardment, deliver and distribute life-saving supplies and do everything they can to provide shelter and relief to the local people. They have worked hard, shed sweat and blood, and made the ultimate sacrifice. So far, over 170 UNRWA staff have been killed in the conflict. We'd like to express our deepest condolences to them and pay our highest regard to the humanitarian workers who are sticking to their posts. I'd like to make 3 points. First, UNRWA is indispensable for the humanitarian assistance to Gaza. Secretary General Guterres has clearly highlighted that no UN agency can replace UNRWA. Cutting off the relief work by the agency is cutting off the last lifeline for the people in Gaza. In addition, UNRWA is providing relief to Palestinian refugees in West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, among others. If UNRWA stops its operations, millions of Palestinian refugees will lose the support, and the stability of relevant countries will be impacted. China urges Israel to stop its interference with and restrictions on UNRWA's work and ensure its normal operations. Second, we support the UN in conducting an independent and impartial investigation of the allegations against UNRWA staff, but the investigation should not have a predetermined conclusion. Still less should it be used to deny UNRWA's contribution, even undermine its work. Individual cases should not overshadow the big picture of Gaza's humanitarian relief. The independent review group appointed by Secretary General Guterres has clearly pointed out that there are a significant number of mechanisms within the agency to ensure neutrality. China rejects malicious attacks on UNRWA in the absence of any solid evidence, or using the investigation as a pretext to launch unfounded accusations against the entire UN system. We urge Israel to immediately stop its attacks and smearing and call on relevant countries to resume its funding to UNRWA as soon as possible. Third, the current priority is to implement the Council resolution to realize an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Providing relief under bombardment is an impossible task. The Council resolution 2728 clearly demands a ceasefire in Gaza. Regrettably, the month of Ramadan is over, but a ceasefire still hasn't materialized. We urge Israel to follow the demand of the resolution, stop its military offenses in Gaza, abandon its offensive plans on Rafah, lift its blockade of Gaza, open up all land crossings, ensure rapid, adequate, and safe access for humanitarian supplies, and provide necessary security guarantee for the operations of humanitarian agencies. We also urge the U.S. to uphold a just position and make sincere efforts in this regard. President, tomorrow the Council will hold a high-level debate on the question of Palestine. We hope the international community could take that opportunity to show determination and willingness to push for the full implementation by Israel of the Council resolution and an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, and work towards gradual de-escalation in the region. The Council will also vote on a draft resolution on the mission of Palestine to full UN membership. We are hopeful that justice will prevail and the Palestinian people's just cause of restoring the legitimate national rights will be realized. China will continue to work with the international community to tirelessly promote an early end of the fighting in Gaza, easing of the humanitarian catastrophe, implementation of the two-state solution, and lasting peace and security in the Middle East. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
I thank you, Madam President, and I thank the Commissioner General for his statement. I will make 3 points today. Firstly, France reiterates its call for complete, large-scale and unhindered humanitarian access and deliveries to be guaranteed to meet the immense needs of the civilian population in Gaza. In the face of this humanitarian catastrophe, all possible crossing points must be open. It is imperative for the United Nations to have the necessary authorizations and access to deliver humanitarian aid in safety throughout the whole of the territory of the Gaza Strip, including in the north of the enclave. France pays tribute to all the humanitarian personnel of UNRWA, the United Nations and NGOs who have been killed in Gaza. For 75 years, UNRWA has played an indispensable role for the 5.9 million Palestinian refugees in occupied Palestinian territory in Lebanon, in Syria and in Jordan. In the Gaza Strip, UNRWA is currently even more essential than ever in order to bring essential humanitarian aid to the civilian population in Palestine. In this regard, France has supported UNRWA for civilians in Gaza and will make its annual contribution for 2024 in order to allow the office to continue its humanitarian operations. France recalls the need to work to achieve a political two-state solution, a political solution which is just, equitable and realistic and sustainable for Palestinian refugees within a peace agreement framework. UNRWA plays an important role for the refugees and for host countries in the absence of this solution. Madam President, it is essential for UNRWA to absolutely ensure the principle of neutrality. Allegations according to which a number of UNRWA's employees participated in the terrorist attacks of the 7th of October against Israel are extremely serious. France reiterates its strongest condemnation of the terrorist attacks and the sexual violence committed by Hamas and other terrorist groups on the 7th of October. France demands that all light be shed on these accusations and that strong measures be taken without delay. France welcomes the first measures taken by the Secretary General along with the Commissioner General and noted the interim report of the independent review group led by Ms. Colonna, whose final conclusions will be made public on the 22nd of April. France will be extremely vigilant regarding the full implementation of the recommendations of the report by the agency in order to ensure that the office fully respects the United Nations principles and the humanitarian principles of independence, neutrality and impartiality. Madam President, France recalls that this Council has demanded the immediate and unconditional release of the hostages held by Hamas and other terrorist groups. This must happen without delay. France will also continue to work towards an immediate, sustainable ceasefire so as to bring an end to the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza. The two-state solution is the only one which can meet the legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian and Israeli people and guarantee peace and security in the Middle East. The Palestinian Authority has a central role to play in this process in both the West Bank and Gaza. France will continue its mobilization in this regard, in the Security Council and in the region. France has put a draft resolution to this Council which addresses all of these dimensions, and France encourages all members to support this initiative. I thank you.
Of France for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Like my colleagues before me, I'd like to extend our gratitude to Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, Commissioner General for UNRWA. Thank you for your briefing. We commend the efforts he's undertaking as is his organization to alleviate the suffering of the civilian population in Gaza, and this at a time when UNRWA itself has lost many of its staff. I extend my deepest condolences to their families and friends. The humanitarian situation in Gaza is catastrophic and is only getting worse. Famine is imminent. The entire population of the Gaza Strip is facing high levels of acute food insecurity. To help meet these enormous needs, Switzerland has allocated additional 100 million USD in humanitarian aid for the Middle East region. We reiterate that a political solution is necessary. UN Security Council resolutions 2728, 2720, and 2712 must be implemented without delay. In particular, a ceasefire must be observed immediately. This is absolutely vital if humanitarian aid workers are to be able to fully perform their vital activities. We'd also like to reaffirm our call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. UNRWA is the biggest humanitarian actor in Gaza. No other agency or organization could take over all of its tasks as things stand. At the regional level, and in the absence of a political solution to the conflict, UNRWA is also essential in helping to prevent further destabilization of the situation by providing essential services in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Jordan, and in Syria. Switzerland is disquieted by serious charges brought against 12 UNRWA employees suspected of involvement in the acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas on 7 October 2023, which we've strongly condemned. Switzerland has taken note of immediate measures taken by UNRWA, including the immediate termination of the accused. We expect the investigation of the Office of Internal Oversight Services, OIOS, will shed light on these allegations. Switzerland also stresses the importance of strong mechanisms to ensure UNRWA's neutrality and accountability, which are the subject of Ms. Colonna's independent review. We also note that UNRWA has already launched an internal action plan to carry out certain reforms. We look forward to a swift conclusion of the aforementioned processes to be diligently implemented. The recommendations thereof should be diligently implemented. Switzerland calls on Israel and any other state in possession of information to cooperate fully with the UN and with Ms. Colonna. Madam President, suffering and large-scale destruction have reached very high levels in the region. This is also demonstrated by the fact that 161 UNRWA facilities have been damaged or destroyed by hostilities, killing people seeking safety and protection. The fact that UNRWA-operated schools, where children should be learning in preparation for their future, the fact that the majority of them, almost all of them, have been turned into emergency shelters for displaced persons, also attest to the fact that the situation is catastrophic. It's high time for the parties to the conflict to unswervingly respect international law, in particular humanitarian and international humanitarian law and human rights law. Parties must protect civilians and all those who are not combatants. All parties must allow and facilitate rapid and unimpeded humanitarian access to those in need, including in the north of the Gaza Strip. Every occupying power is duty-bound under international humanitarian law to meet the basic needs of the population under its control. According to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ order issued on the 28th of March, Israel in particular must take all the necessary and effective measures, working in close cooperation with the UN, to ensure the provision by all interested parties of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian aid. We've said it over and over again. We urgently need a political horizon based on the two-state solution. This solution remains the basis for peace and stability in the region. Two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace within secure and recognized borders. Thank you.
Switzerland, for their statement, I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Madam President, thank you for convening this meeting in response to the request from the delegation of Jordan. Allow me to acknowledge the presence of the distinguished ministers and other high-level officials in today's meeting, and to also thank Commissioner General Lazzarini for the valuable information provided. At the outset, Guyana salutes Commissioner General Lazzarini and his staff for their dedicated efforts amidst the most trying circumstances, and to commiserate with them on the loss of 178 of their colleagues who were killed in service to the Palestinian people. Madam President, Guyana is deeply concerned about the circumstances under which UNRWA is forced to carry out its operations in the Gaza Strip. We have taken note that several UNRWA premises, including schools, health centers, and aid distribution centers, have been directly hit by munitions used in the conflict. It is troubling that these incidents have occurred, although the agency has complied with the requirements to provide the coordinates of all its premises to the parties to the conflict through the UN humanitarian notification system. The indiscriminate targeting of these premises has resulted in the killing of both UNRWA personnel and civilians who sought shelter in these facilities. Guyana emphasizes the obligation of all parties to comply with international law, including provisions related to the inviolability of UN premises. In this context, we call for full accountability for the violations that have taken place since the start of the current cycle of violence on 7th of October. There should be no impunity for such brazen disregard of international law. Madam President, Guyana is equally concerned by the ongoing campaign to discredit and dismantle UNRWA. The agency has been maligned and some staff members accused of being involved in the attacks of October 7th, without any credible evidence being provided to substantiate these accusations. Questions have also been raised about the agency's neutrality. While it is the right of any member state to voice concerns about the operation of any UN agency, Guyana underscores that there is also a concomitant responsibility to ensure that those concerns are substantiated. It is simply unacceptable to put forward accusations without providing credible supporting evidence. In the case of UNRWA, these accusations have led to very costly consequences for ordinary Palestinian civilians. Several member states decided to cease their funding to the agency at a time when the population in Gaza is faced with an unprecedented humanitarian crisis, owing to ongoing hostilities by the Israeli Defense Force. These decisions were also taken against the backdrop of persistent funding shortfalls, which continue to affect the agency's ability to effectively carry out its mandate. While acknowledging that several countries have resumed their funding to UNRWA, Guyana calls on others, in the name of humanity, to reverse their decisions to suspend funding. We look forward to the final report in a few days from the Independent Review Group. Madam President, allow me to also address the claim from the Israeli side that the UN is unable to deal with the volume of aid that is available for distribution in Gaza. Aid distribution in a war zone is not a simple matter. It involves a number of critical parts that must all function well. For example, inspection processes must be agile. From all reports, these are slow and unpredictable. UN agencies like UNRWA have the capacity, but they have no control over deliberate impediments. We call again for a ceasefire and for the removal of these impediments. Madam President, UNRWA's indispensable existence for the last 75 years is a reminder that the international community has not yet delivered justice to the Palestinian people. Its mandate is therefore important to the broader objective of achieving the two-state solution. Offering critical services to Palestinians made refugees by the Nakba of 1948 is a key part of delivering justice to them. And although more than 7 decades have passed, we must never lose sight of the quest for ultimate justice in the achievement of a permanent resolution. UNRWA has been a lifeline to the 5.9 million Palestinian refugees in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. It continues to provide critical services in education, healthcare, infrastructure, and other areas, all aimed at ensuring that Palestinians can live with some semblance of dignity while continuing the quest to exercise their inalienable right to self-determination. There is simply no other organization that can replace or substitute the tremendous capacity of UNRWA or manage the sheer scale of its operations. It is our collective responsibility as United Nations member states to uphold the mandate created in 1949 when UNRWA was established. I hasten to add here that this mandate was not meant to be a permanent one, neither should it have lasted this long. But any attempts to dismantle UNRWA should simultaneously align with delivering justice for the Palestinians. It is only then that UNRWA will no longer be required. When a thriving state of Palestine is created, living side by side in peace with the state of Israel, we will have an opportunity shortly to help Palestinians take that important step in that direction. In conclusion, Guyana urges all council members to be proactive in their efforts to keep UNRWA's doors open and to keep its operations effective and predictable. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statements. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank Commissioner General Lazzarini for the detailed briefing on the challenges confronting the UNRWA. Let's go back in time. Prior to the horrendous terrorist attack by Hamas against Israeli citizens on the 7th October last year, at the United Nations, there was a strong consensus on the devotion and dedication of UNRWA and its personnel in assisting Palestinian refugees, not only in Palestine, but also in neighboring countries. Since the outbreak of the military operation by Israel in Gaza, and prior to the announcement of the allegations that some UNRWA staff members participated in the heinous terrorist attack, no one denied the sacrifice and indispensable role of UNRWA in assisting Gazan civilians in despair. As the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza deepens, including food and water scarcity, the role of humanitarian agencies such as UNRWA is now more crucial than ever. Let's be clear. The devotion and sacrifice of UNRWA has not changed in spite of the serious allegations. With its 13,000 staff members in Gaza, 178 of whom were killed in this conflict, UNRWA is the core agency in international humanitarian efforts in Gaza. All humanitarian agencies delivering life-saving assistance to Gaza are highly appreciated and must be protected under international humanitarian law. But no agencies other than UNRWA have its comparable capacity and devotion. Of course, we also share the concern on the allegations and appreciate the Secretary General's swift initiation of the investigation by OIOS, as well as his appointment of an independent review group to assess UNRWA's neutrality. We believe that the swift release of the interim reports by OIOS will once again ensure the credibility of UNRWA, and the Republic of Korea will closely review the findings. We also hope that the final report by the independent review group would include constructive recommendations for UNRWA's enhancing neutrality. Madam President, the role of UNRWA in Gaza is irreplaceable. It is a lifeline for Palestinians. Thus, the Republic of Korea has provided consistent and increased assistance to UNRWA. We welcome the announcements that major donors countries have resumed their contributions, and we will also keep contributing to UNRWA. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea. The representative of the Russian Federation has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. We regret that today the Council once again saw an attempt to spread disinformation. This is completely inexcusable. This was an attempt made by the United States. Assertions to the fact that Russia and China vetoed the very complicated US draft resolution, and as a result of that, as a result of the veto, the Council couldn't protect humanitarian workers. This is blatant lies and manipulation, these allegations. This call is contained in Resolution 2712 and 2720. And this is, in fact, because we vetoed the US project, there's also Resolution 2728, and that refers to this call. This is not the first time that the US delegation is basically playing a shell game and is trying to trick the international community. It's regrettable that American diplomacy has sunk so low. And yet, what were we expecting from a country which vetoed draft resolutions 4 times, draft resolutions calling for an immediate ceasefire? A country which called 2728, Resolution 2728, non-binding. By acting in this fashion, the United States are becoming directly complicit in the killing of 200 humanitarian workers and over 30,000 Palestinians in Gaza. Although we knew this even earlier when Washington used every which way to help its ally, giving its ally carte blanche so that it could kill Palestinians unpunished. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. I apologize for taking the floor, but I need to respond to the remarks from the representative of the Russian Federation. I mean, it is indeed a fact that Russia vetoed this resolution. No one should contest that. But to blame the United States for the situation in the region is totally unfair. But it's typical of Russian disinformation activities, and I'm not going to further with any additional response. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Zayed Abu Amr, Special Representative of the President of the Observer State of Palestine.
Madam President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me at the outset to express our deep appreciation to the Maltese Presidency for holding this important ministerial meeting. I would also like to thank Jordan for taking the initiative to request this meeting on UNRWA and the challenges it has been facing during these dangerous circumstances. Of course, we would like to express our deep thanks to Algeria, the Arab member of the Security Council, for placing the Palestinian question as a priority on the Council's agenda. We would also like to express our deep appreciation to UNRWA's Commissioner General, Mr. Philippe Lazzarini, and all its staff and humanitarian workers who are providing urgent relief to the Palestinian people, including in Gaza. We salute your courage your dedication as you carry out this noble humanitarian mission, risking your own lives to provide relief for our people. We express our condolences to you and to Palestinians on the loss of our brothers and sisters, your colleagues, the humanitarian worker. We hope you stay safe in these difficult times. Madam President, I would be remiss not to call for an immediate ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, for the unobstructed delivery of humanitarian assistance, for the implementation of Security Council resolutions, including resolutions 2712, 2720, and 2728. We are all fully aware that no innocent can be saved, no relief can be provided, no famine can be stopped in Gaza as long as Israel continues its ground invasion and airstrikes targeting civilians, homes, infrastructure, schools, shelters, hospitals, humanitarian facilities and workers, rescue teams, and even medical staff. No effective humanitarian response can be provided, no sufficient relief can be provided to Gaza as long as the harsh Israeli aggression and siege continue unabated, with threats to invade Rafah, now hosting 1.5 million refugees from Gaza, half of whom are children. Rafah, which is considered the humanitarian gate for the entry of assistance to Gaza and for the evacuation of the sick and the wounded. Pressure must be put on Israel, the occupying power, in a firm way so it respects the international law and the international humanitarian law to stop its policy of collective punishment, starvation, and the use of famine as a weapon of war. Allow me to express my deepest thanks to Sisterly Egypt for its efforts to coordinate the delivery of the necessary humanitarian assistance to Gaza during this humanitarian catastrophe caused by the Israeli siege and aggression. We would also like to thank all states and organizations helping in the evacuation of the sick and the wounded and providing the necessary medical support and care for them. We call for taking serious and firm steps to open all border crossings in the Strip and to compel Israel to carry out its obligations as an occupying power and providing basic services to people under its occupation and being held accountable in line with international law. Massacres against innocent people in Gaza have been going for 6 months. Isn't it high time for this killing, this destruction and displacement to stop? Madam President, the General Assembly established the UNRWA in 1949 in line with Resolution 302. This resolution was very clear on the reason for UNRWA's establishment and mandate. It was very clear when UNRWA should be terminated. This is when the question of the Palestinian refugees is solved. Based on that, the General Assembly renews UNRWA's mandate periodically, despite every attempt and campaign to cut it off from the United Nations, to cut off this special humanitarian organization, UNRWA, from the United Nations. There is no alternative for the UNRWA. The UNRWA is not a mere humanitarian project. It is a historic witness of the commitment by the international community, rather its obligation regarding Palestinian refugees who had to leave their home after the 1948 Nakba following the decision on the partition of Palestine in 1947 until a just and comprehensive solution is found for their cause in line with General Assembly Resolution 194. UNRWA has become part of the history of Palestinian refugees. Its role has become vital in their present and their daily life. It is the only life for many people for a dignified life, especially given the current serious, rough situation where fear and tensions are rising. No other alternative can enjoy this position and the trust of the Palestinian refugees. The UNRWA is the only UN agency that has such skill, readiness, operational capacity, experience, and expertise to carry out humanitarian work at a large scale, especially given what is happening in the Gaza Strip and the need to reopen schools, to provide education, to provide psychological and health support for children who have been deprived of such support during this school year. The agency, UNRWA, is the best thing the United Nations can do during these circumstances by combining international oversight, national capacities, and skillful coordination to ensure humanitarian assistance, protection, sustainable development, and the protection of rights. Mr. President, or Madam President rather, Israeli campaigns on UNRWA are not new and are not secret. Israel, for a long time, has instigated against UNRWA, has targeted its headquarters, stocks, shelters, and staff. It thwarted its operations in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and in Gaza. It launched a slander and instigation campaigns against UNRWA staff and against Palestinian refugees. Despite all of that, UNRWA remained the best example of responsibility sharing and collective work among the international community in line with the international law and ethical and political obligations to alleviate the humanitarian suffering of the Palestinian people until a just solution is found for their cause. We are deeply grateful to Arab host countries, namely Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria, for their unprecedented support and for hosting Palestinian refugees for more than 7 decades, for sharing their resources and providing everything for their relief and development. We are grateful to all donor countries that have, for years, provided support to allow UNRWA to offer its vital assistance to Palestinian refugees, including countries that did not suspend their funding, countries that resumed their funding to UNRWA, and countries that doubled and sped up their funding to UNRWA, especially during the current circumstances. Your support has always given UNRWA and Palestinian refugees some hope and dignity, which were taken away because of the injustice, aggression, and the lack of a just solution. Madam President, once again, we appreciate the wise leadership of the United Nations Secretary General, Mr. Antonio Guterres, in supporting UNRWA and the steps he has taken by asking the OIOS to conduct an investigation in the Israeli allegations against some UNRWA employees, to establish an independent review group for UNRWA's operations. We are waiting the outcome of the investigation and the report of the group. Until then, we call upon states that have suspended their funding of the UNRWA to reverse their decision and to resume the funding. We remind everyone that the lives of millions of marginalized youth, women, and children are in real danger. The humanitarian challenges we are facing are unprecedented. They require doubled efforts and exceptional empathy. Political, financial, and operational support should be provided to UNRWA to address the growing humanitarian crisis and to face the imminent famine. No other operational structure can carry out such a humongous task. Madam President, pressure must be brought on Israel so that it immediately stops hindering the operations of the UNRWA and stops violating its mandate. It should stop targeting UNRWA's facilities and it should stop attempting to expel it from occupied eastern Jerusalem. Israel should stop obstructing the movement of UNRWA staff and humanitarian trucks. Israel should respect the Convention on the Safety of United Nations and Associated Staff and the Convention on the Privileges and Immunities of the United Nations, as well as any other convention. Any attempt to hinder the work of UNRWA needs accountability. Madam President, it is high time to gather the necessary political will to end the violent, illegal Israeli military occupation of our land, to stop the Nakba of the Palestinian people. It is high time for the Palestinian people to enjoy their inalienable humanitarian and political rights, to achieve peace and justice, which will allow our people, including our refugees, to live in freedom, dignity, and safety. Until then, supporting UNRWA in its areas of operations in Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied Palestinian territories and Jordan, including East Jerusalem, remains an integral part of international efforts to alleviate the suffering of our people. It is a main share of the permanent responsibility of the United Nations regarding the Palestinian question. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abu Amr for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, from the very moment that the Arabs rejected Resolution 181 in 1947, the partition plan, and began their war to destroy Israel, the Palestinians have tried to exploit the UN for their goal to reverse history. The UN and its bodies have not only failed in de-escalating the conflict or advancing a solution, the UN is directly responsible for perpetuating this conflict and ensuring that the Palestinians will continue to reject any peace plan or compromise because the political makeup here, the political makeup of the UN, gives them hope that they will achieve their original objective, which is, as you know, the destruction of the State of Israel. And one of the weapons that the UN has crafted to protract this conflict is UNRWA. UNRWA, the organization that so many of you fund or support, is the UN's single biggest obstacle to a solution. Colleagues, after it was founded, UNRWA was quickly hijacked by the Palestinians and weaponized into an instrument of war. UNRWA's goal is not aid or real education. In practice, UNRWA is creating a sea of Palestinian refugees, millions of them, indoctrinated to believe that Israel belongs to them. And the end goal is to use these so-called refugees and their libelous right of return, a right that doesn't exist, to flood Israel and destroy the Jewish state. It's not a secret, by the way. This has been the Palestinians' plan from day one. After their failed war to destroy the Jewish state in 1948, the Arabs were then left with two options. One, accept the result of their actions and come to terms with Israel as the Jewish state, like the UN decided, the partition plan, a Jewish state, an Arab state. Or two, to invest every resource possible in ensuring that this conflict will not end until they get what they want, a one-state solution, not a Jewish one. Another Arab state in the Middle East. They chose a war of terror to eliminate the one and only Jewish state. UNRWA became part of their arsenal. They immediately hijacked and weaponized UNRWA and turned it into a fully Palestinian organization. I emphasize, just because UNRWA has a thin layer of Europeans in charge of collecting donations and garnering support, it doesn't change the fact that UNRWA is a Palestinian organization fully committed to the Jewish state's destruction. And how does UNRWA do this? Through their facilities, through the content in their textbooks, through their teachers and employees who support terror and glorify Hitler. One of UNRWA's primary goals is to indoctrinate Palestinian children to the idea of destroying Israel through the return, by brainwashing the Palestinians into believing that the war of 1948 is not over, that they are still refugees 76 years later, even though they were born in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and countries around the world. So I ask you, in 1949, there were approximately 500,000 Palestinians refugees. And today, according to UNRWA, there are, correct me if I'm mistaken, 5.6 million. Which other group of refugees, try to name a single one, has a UN body mandated not for their integration, not to end their refugehood, but to ensure that it continues generation after generation? This is exactly what UNRWA does. Colleagues, we hear a lot about Palestinian refugee camps, whether in Gaza, Judea and Samaria, or Lebanon. But have any of you took a moment to ask yourselves why? Why there are Palestinian refugee camps 76 years later? How can there be a Palestinian refugee camp in Gaza or next to Ramallah? These are places with no Israeli presence and complete Palestinian control. How can you be a refugee from Palestine when you live in a Palestinian city? Don't you see the paradox? Don't you see their goal for the future? If the Palestinian Authority is so keen on establishing an independent state, remember it for tomorrow, why are there still refugee camps in its territory? If a state was truly the Palestinians' goal, then these second, third, and even fourth generation descendants of refugees would be living in regular Palestinian cities and not camps. But sadly, this is not the Palestinians' goal. Their goal is still the annihilation of Israel. And one of their weapons is educating. UNRWA is the world's biggest advocate for a one-state solution. I repeat, UNRWA is the world's biggest advocate for a one-state solution, a Palestinian state from the river to the sea. Think about it. What makes the descendants of Palestinian refugees different from all other refugees? Why must there be a separate UN agency for Palestinian refugees, while all other refugees from Syria, from Sudan, millions, from Ukraine, from Afghanistan, are aided only by UNHCR? For them, it's enough. Why for Palestinians is refugeehood hereditary? Think honestly about this. No other group of refugees can pass on their refugee status to their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren in perpetuity. And no other refugee remains a refugee when they receive citizenship in another country. Not the Palestinians. There are Palestinians today with Jordanian, American, and Swedish passports whose great-grandparents left Israel in 1948. Yet to this day, they remain on UNRWA's rosters as Palestinian refugee. It's absurd. By the way, do you know that Mohammed Hadid, the father of the two supermodels, Bella and Gigi Hadid, he lives now in California. I think he's a billionaire. He is still a refugee according to UNRWA. You can't make this stuff up. Why isn't UNRWA's primary goal is to settle the refugees, settle them? This dysfunctional system has no parallel anywhere else in the world, and it is a fundamental part of the problem. When the UN promotes an agency that preserves refugee camps and the refugee identity, nearly 80 years after the war, then all that is accomplished is the perpetuation of the conflict. What an achievement. UNRWA continues to feed the Palestinian people a lie, that the world supports their demand of return, that as long as the original refugees, along with their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, have still not returned to where they once lived before they started a war in 1948 against the resolution of the UN, they will always be excluded from society and they will forever remain branded as refugees. In fact, in Lebanon, one example, Palestinian refugees face apartheid-like treatment. They suffer restricted access to public health, education, and social services, and face significant restrictions on their right to work and own property. Not only is this apartheid in practice, it is UN-facilitated apartheid, because they live in your camps. Without the absurd hereditary refugeehood fueled by UNRWA today, Palestinian refugees in Lebanon would be Lebanese citizens, not a minority discriminated against. And as more time passes, the more this problem will grow. More refugees, quote unquote, mean more services, more aid, more staff, more budget. This is not a sustainable practice. I ask you, what will you do, all of you, in 50 years if there is still no peace? UNRWA's budget will pass, how much? $3 billion? Where will you start? When will you start to think about diminishing the problem instead of keeping it alive and letting it grow? Sadly, you are providing aspirin to a body contaminated with cancerous cells. Colleagues, the UN and its bodies were established to collaborate with law-abiding entities, to work hand in hand with governments, with NGOs. But what the UN is not equipped for is to collaborate with terror organizations. Hamas saw this weakness and quickly capitalized on it. Hamas was handed on a silver platter, a UN agency with an immense budget and global legitimacy. And UNRWA was totally infiltrated by Hamas. Today, in Gaza, UNRWA is Hamas and Hamas is UNRWA. And UNRWA has become an instrumental part of Gazans terror war machine. Israel has shared evidence proving that 17% of UNRWA employees in Gaza are members of terror groups, and 50% of UNRWA employees have a first-degree relative who is part of a terror organization. Hamas terrorists also hold key positions in UNRWA, and 18 UNRWA school principals in Gaza are active Hamas terrorists. 18. Try to imagine the education that Gazan children are receiving when their principal is a genocidal jihadist. But for some of you, Hamas is not a terrorist organization, so I'm not sure I'll be able to convince you. Seeing as UNRWA has been infiltrated by terrorists at all levels, it should be no surprise that so much UNRWA aid is redirected away from civilians and to terrorists. And aside from employing terrorists, UNRWA's infrastructure is also exploited by terrorists. A Hamas command base and data center was recently located underneath UNRWA headquarters, and it was connected directly to UNRWA's power supply. Terror tunnels have been found underneath UNRWA facilities. The UN recognized it. And over 30 of these facilities housed weapons and terror infrastructure. Yet, rather than take responsibility for the weaponization of UNRWA, Commissioner General al-Zahra has chosen to say that he had no knowledge of Hamas's hold on his own agency. I'm sorry, this is blatantly false. Israel, for years, exposed terror tunnels under UNRWA schools and supplied evidence of Hamas's exploitation of UNRWA. I told it to you when we met. We implored Mr. Lazzarini and the Secretary General to carry out a comprehensive search of all UNRWA facilities 3 years ago in Gaza. Yet, not only did they refuse, they chose to bury their heads in the sand and ignore reality. Colleagues, the October 7th massacre was the embodiment of the Palestinian so-called right of return. That is exactly how they understand it. But it doesn't have to be this way. There are alternatives to UNRWA, among them NGOs and other UN agencies. Israel cannot and will not allow UNRWA to continue in Gaza as it did in the past. I repeat, there are alternatives to UNRWA, and it's up to you if they can succeed. Madam President, today is not 1948. Israel is not going anywhere. Israel will remain the Jewish state, and the Palestinians will never be able to turn back the clock. History will not be rewritten. While I know this, and you know this, the Palestinians tragically still don't know this. And the reason they don't know it is because you continue funding UNRWA and fueling this deranged and perverse vision of flooding Israel with millions of descendants of Palestinian refugees. UNRWA is giving them destructive hope that Israel can be annihilated. The time has come to defund UNRWA. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Israel for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ayman Safadi, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates of Jordan.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Madam President, dear colleagues. Thank you for acting on Jordan's request to hold this special session on UNRWA. Dear colleagues, Gaza is starving. Its 2.3 million population is facing famine. This is the doing of Israel, which is using starvation as a weapon, in violation of international law, in defiance of the collective will of the world as expressed through the General Assembly and Security Council resolutions, and in complete disregard to human values. The suffering is beyond words. Only one agency has the knowledge, the ability, and the infrastructure to help ease it. It is UNRWA, the backbone of humanitarian efforts in Gaza. Israel wants to break it. Do not allow it to do so. UNRWA deserves your support because only UNRWA has the ability to meaningfully help starved Palestinians in Gaza and provide vital services to Palestinian refugees in its 5 areas of operation. UNRWA deserves your respect for the sacrifices it has made to ensure Palestinians in Gaza do not die from hunger. 178 persons of UNRWA staff have fallen to Israel's bullets and bombs. And Felipe, we renew our deepest condolences. Our hearts go out to those victims and to their families. Dear colleagues, the little aid that Israel is allowing into Gaza is not being efficiently distributed because Israel has prevented UNRWA from fulfilling the mandate that the UN gave it. And the UN is the whole world. The UN is all countries of the world. So when the UN decides, it is the world that decided. It's the countries that are members of the UN that decided. Attacking the UN is attacking the whole international community, is attacking international law, is attacking the multilateral system that we all support and the UN has been created to preserve. Children are dying because UNRWA and other aid agencies are forbidden from helping them in Gaza. Some of those who tried have been killed in cold blood by Israeli occupation forces. Even after the global outcry against the killing of the World Central Kitchen aid workers, Israel targeted a UNICEF team who miraculously dodged death, and there has been no independent investigation of those crimes. There's been no effort to force an independent investigation of those cold-blooded crimes that were there for everybody to see. Dear colleagues, the truth is another victim of Israel's aggression on Gaza. The disinformation campaign that the Israeli government has been spreading against UNRWA, the lies, the distortion of history, and the distortion of the present must not shape worldview of the agencies. UNRWA's essential work, its commitment to UN values, its sacrifices, and the dedication of its staff must. Israel leveled allegations against 12 of UNRWA's 13,000 staff members in Gaza. The agency acted responsibly. The UN fired those staff members even before an investigation was launched. The agency welcomed and fully cooperated with an independent investigation which is headed by former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna. The UN also launched its own internal investigation into the allegations. UNRWA has nothing to hide. It faced up to its responsibilities. It has committed to fixing any wrongdoings or shortfalls should any be found. Yet the Israeli witch hunt of the agency continues. This witch hunt started long before the allegations against the 12 members of its staff were made. The agency has been the target of a political assassination campaign for years. Israel wants to kill UNRWA and what UNRWA represents. The purpose of the attack on UNRWA is to kill the Palestinian refugees' rights, to kill the Palestinian issue, and to kill the discussion that there is an occupation that is illegal, that is inhumane, that must end. It will not succeed. UNRWA must be protected now in the same way that it was protected in the past. For UNRWA is a bright spot in the misery that Israel has forced on Palestinian refugees. For it has provided hope, education, and opportunity for Palestinian refugees in Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. About 5.6 million refugees look to UNRWA for that hope. They see it as a symbol that the world still cares about their plight, and that the world still cares about alleviating the historical injustice to which they have been subjected. Over 300,000 students used to attend UNRWA schools in Gaza before the Israeli aggression forced what it did not destroy among them into becoming overcrowded shelters for hundreds of thousands of the 1.7 million Palestinians it has displaced in Gaza. Hundreds of thousands more in the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon will be denied their right to education and medical care if it were not for UNRWA. Over 100,000 boys and girls of the 2.3 million Palestinian refugees in Jordan received their education at UNRWA schools. No other agency can do what UNRWA does. Dear colleagues, UNRWA was born out of the Nakba of 1948, when Israel pushed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians from their homes on their ancestral land. The United Nations created it as a temporary agency to care for refugees until they can go back home. They have not. In 1967, more Palestinians join them in displacement. The refugees' plight persists. UNRWA must remain. That is the simple fact. That is the simple obligation. That is legal, that is moral, that is human. UNRWA must continue to implement its mandate until the refugee issue is resolved in accordance with international law and relevant UN resolutions which uphold their right to return and compensation, and in the context of a comprehensive solution to the conflict. That solution will not be attained unless the cancer that is the occupation, unless the evil that is the occupation has ended and the Palestinians get to live in dignity and freedom in their own independent, sovereign state on their ancestral homeland. My dear colleagues, UNRWA is indispensable. It is irreplaceable. It is more needed now than ever before, as children are literally dying from starvation and dehydration in the inferno of pain, death, and suffering the Israeli war has made Gaza. The war in Gaza must stop, and it will stop. And when it does, the world will see the inhumane reality Israel has forced on Gaza and has largely kept away from the eyes of the world by banning journalists from entering the Strip and covering the destruction. Then, when that happens, when the world can actually see the amount of destruction and death and suffering that Israel has brought to Gaza, the world will recognize even more how much it needs UNRWA and how vital UNRWA's role is. We thank all our partners who continue to help UNRWA. And we urge you all, protect UNRWA now, just like you protected it in the past. Support it financially and politically. For supporting UNRWA is supporting regional stability. Saving UNRWA is saving lives, saving hope, and standing on the side of justice, and on the side of the right of Palestinian people to live in dignity, in freedom, without fear, without intimidation, without deprivation, and without the oppression of having no hope that their plight will end, and watching their kin in Gaza being killed and on the West Bank being subject to all kinds of oppression, attacks, settlers, terrorism, confiscation of their land, building of settlements on their houses, on their farms. That has to stop. Only if we do that will the Middle East has the peace that it deserves, and only if the Palestinian people get their right will the Palestinians and the Israelis and all of us live in peace. Thank you so much.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Safadi for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Ahmet Yildiz, Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs of Turkey.
Thank you, Madam President. At the outset, we extend our thanks to you as Maltese Presidency and to Jordan for convening this timely meeting. I also express appreciation to Commissioner General Lazzarini for his briefing and commend his efforts to fulfill UNRWA's mandate under extremely challenging circumstances. He depicted the situation in the field very well and very clearly, and he also revealed how some calls about UNRWA, subversive calls about UNRWA, how they are ill-intended. And unfortunately, speeches of the Israeli representative confirm this. Madam President, as we speak today, the suffering in occupied Palestinian territories is at unprecedented levels. The West Bank is under immense tension with settler violence and growing Israeli atrocities on the Palestinian people. Unlawful settlements, demolition of houses, forced evictions, and land confiscations continue as daily routines. 7,000 people arrested since 7 October last year for no reason. Gaza faces the most formidable human-made disaster in modern ages. Unseen destruction and massacres take place before our eyes. It is tormenting and heartbreaking. Human toll is well beyond the number of declared casualties. people are starving to death. A whole generation is being lost to violence and vicious cycle of indignation and impoverishment. This is insulting to our humanity. Security Council resolutions demanding an immediate ceasefire and preliminary measures of the International Court of Justice have not been implemented. International law is brazenly breached. Against this painful backdrop, UNRWA shines as a beacon of hope for the Palestinian people, indeed for all of us. UNRWA workers, UNRWA staff are selfless in distributing food, providing teaching as well as medical and social services, among other essential tasks, under life-threatening circumstances, while more than 200 UN personnel in Gaza have been killed by the Israeli attacks. Yet, the Israeli government continues to pursue its defamatory campaign to discredit the agency, although its allegations have not been substantiated. UNRWA was envisioned as a temporary entity by the General Assembly when its mandate was first enforced in 1949, following the mass deportations of the Palestinians from their homeland. Therefore, UNRWA represents the right of return and dignity. UNRWA tells us that the Palestinian question is alive and it should be solved in a fair way.
قلب الضريح ضامي قلب الضريح ضامي مولاتي